September 1975. A trade show floor in San Francisco called WestCon. At one small, unremarkable table, a man sets down two glass jars, both filled to the top with tiny black computer chips. A handwritten sign leans against them. It just says $25. At every other table in that building, the biggest names in electronics, Intel, Motorola, are selling similar chips for nearly $200 each. Crowds start to form. People are stunned. Is this some kind of mistake? It wasn't a mistake, but there was something nobody in that crowd knew. Years later, the man behind that table admitted it publicly. Most of the chips filling those jars didn't actually work. Only the ones near the top were real. It didn't matter. What was real was about to change computing forever. That chip would end up inside the Apple I, the Commodore 64, the best-selling personal computer model in history, the Atari 2600, the original Nintendo Entertainment System. And the small company that built it would barely survive one more year on its own. This is the story of MOS Technology, the company that triggered the home computing revolution and nearly vanished in the process. To understand how that trade show moment happened, we have to go back further, to Motorola, a few years earlier. An engineer named Chuck Peddle was working on Motorola's new 6800 processor. It was a genuinely capable chip, but Motorola was pricing it at $300, sometimes $360 per unit. Peddle believed there was a massive, untapped market if somebody built a cheaper, simpler processor instead of chasing high-end performance. He pitched the idea internally. Motorola said no. So Peddle did something drastic. He convinced 7 other Motorola engineers, including a talented young designer named Bill Mensch, to quit together and join a small, little-known semiconductor firm out in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. That company was MOS Technology, originally founded back in 1969, mostly making chips for calculators. Nobody outside the industry had heard of it. 8 engineers, walking away from one of the biggest names in electronics, betting everything on an idea their own employer had just rejected.
At MOS, this small team got to work almost immediately. Bill Mensch later said he and the others sketched out a near-complete specification for the new chip family on the back of an Arby's napkin. The chip they were building would become known as the 6502. Peddle insisted on personally verifying the very first working silicon himself, testing each instruction one at a time, out loud, while Mensch and another engineer, Rod Orgill, sat and listened. By all accounts, each successful test turned into a small celebration, Peddle calling out results like "Load A works," and the room erupting like a sports crowd, cheering each tiny victory. The finished chip ran at roughly 1 megahertz, about the same clock speed as Motorola's 6800, but thanks to a more efficient internal design, it could complete roughly 4 times as many calculations in the same amount of time. And the price, $25, a tiny fraction of what Intel or Motorola charged. The secret wasn't just the chip's design, it was the manufacturing process. A more refined fabrication technique meant MOS could pull over 100 good working chips out of a single silicon wafer. Motorola's equivalent process yielded only about 10. Better chips, produced 10 times more efficiently, sold for an eighth of the price. That combination is what created the scene at that trade show table. Motorola did not take this quietly. In late 1975, Motorola filed suit against MOS Technology, alleging patent infringement and misappropriation of trade secrets, accusing their former engineers of taking Motorola's own work with them. MOS settled in early 1976, paying Motorola $200,000 and agreeing to discontinue an earlier closely related chip that was pin-compatible with Motorola's own hardware. It was a real cost and real legal exposure, but it barely slowed things down. The 6502 itself, the chip that actually mattered, was untouched and already spreading through the industry. To help customers actually understand what this chip could do, Peddle built a small demonstration computer called the KIM-1, short for Keyboard Input Monitor. It was one of the world's first single-board computers, fully assembled, priced at $245, dramatically undercutting the MIT's Altair 8800, the most famous hobbyist computer of the era, which cost $397 even as a kit you had to assemble yourself. Engineers and hobbyists snapped it up, and one of those hobbyists would go on to change everything. A young engineer named Steve Wozniak got early 6502 units directly from Chuck Peddle. Using that chip, in a garage, he built a computer of his own, the Apple I. From there, it snowballed. The 6502 and its variants went into the Commodore PET, the Commodore VIC-20, and eventually the Commodore 64, which remains to this day the best-selling personal computer model in history. It powered the Atari 2600 and Atari 5200 game consoles, the BBC Micro in the United Kingdom. Later, an enhanced variant powered the original Nintendo Entertainment System. A single chip family from a company almost nobody had heard of a year earlier ended up sitting at the center of the home computer revolution and the video game revolution at the exact same time on multiple continents. And yet, despite triggering all of that, MOS Technology itself was in real financial trouble. The company was minuscule compared to giants like Intel and Motorola, who were pulling in hundreds of millions of dollars a year. MOS simply didn't have that kind of capital cushion. In September 1976, barely 1 year after that trade show table, Commodore International, led by Jack Tramiel, acquired MOS Technology outright. The price, roughly $12 million, a fire sale price for the company behind the chip that was about to reshape the entire industry. With MOS now under Commodore's ownership, other companies relying on the 6502, including Apple, had to shift to sourcing their processors from a different manufacturer, Synertech, instead. And here's a detail that rarely gets told. Bill Mensch, one of the chip's original co-designers, didn't stay. In 1978, he left to found his own company, the Western Design Center in Arizona. Mensch spent the following decades continuing to refine and extend the 6502 architecture on his own terms, designs that are still manufactured today, used in embedded systems and even life support medical devices. In a strange way, the true continuation of the 6502's legacy didn't stay inside MOS or even inside Commodore. It walked out the door a second time with the same engineer who helped build it in the first place.
Under Commodore, MOS Technology was renamed the Commodore Semiconductor Group and continued producing chips, now serving Commodore's own product lines almost exclusively. Chuck Peddle stayed on for a while and pushed Commodore to enter the personal computer market directly. That push led to the Commodore PET in 1977 and eventually the Commodore 64 in 1982. For a stretch, this arrangement genuinely worked, but the company's entire fate was now tied to Commodore's. In 1984, Jack Tramiel, the man who had engineered the original MOS acquisition, left Commodore after boardroom conflicts. Without his leadership, Commodore's strategic direction grew far less stable in the years that followed. A decade later, in 1994, Commodore International declared bankruptcy. The chip-making division that had once been MOS Technology, the company behind the processor that helped launch the entire home computing industry, disappeared along with it. One last detail, almost too fitting to leave out. The original MOS fabrication plant, where all of this history was actually manufactured, was later designated an EPA Superfund cleanup site in 1992 due to chemical leaks from its storage tanks. The birthplace of the chip that powered a generation's computers and game consoles ended its own story as a toxic waste site. So, what actually happened to MOS Technology? In some ways, this isn't really a story about failure at all. The 6502 succeeded beyond almost anyone's imagination. It's arguably one of the most influential pieces of hardware in the entire history of computing. But the company that built it never got to be the one that benefited fully from that success. It was too small, too undercapitalized to survive independently, and within a single year of changing the industry forever, it had to sell itself off just to keep operating. The company that broke Intel and Motorola's pricing monopoly, that put a working processor into Steve Wozniak's hands, that powered the best-selling computer and console systems of an entire era, spent the rest of its existence as somebody else's subsidiary, and eventually disappeared inside somebody else's bankruptcy. The lesson here is a little different from most of the stories we cover. Sometimes a company doesn't fail because of a bad decision. It fails simply because it built something enormous without ever having the resources to hold on to it. And sometimes the real legacy doesn't stay with the company at all. It walks out the door with the person who built it, the way Bill Mensch carried the 6502 forward decades after MOS itself was gone. If you found this one interesting, next time we're covering another company whose invention outlived the company itself. Subscribe so you don't miss it.